Thank you for coming out on a rainy Friday morning. We appreciate it, and especially grateful Kevin Duggan is here. He's from the city of Mountain View and has just been a mentor of mine for many years, so I'm excited. He's spent a lot of time thinking about how cities can prepare for all sorts of challenges, and we had Mountain View's current city manager come talk to the students about sea level rise planning in our city. So, for those of you who don't know, this is the culminating project in the Undergraduate Public Policy program. Most of these capstone projects tend to focus on a current policy analysis, so they're taking a policy that's already existing and analyzing it and using cost-benefit analysis or some kind of quantitative approach. This is a little different. Our client was interested in finding out what the landscape of sea level rise policy is. So instead of analyzing a current policy, they're looking at what are the policies that currently exist in San Mateo County and nationally. So with that, I'll turn it over to Isabelle.
Thank you, Preeti, and thank you all once again for being here this morning. Our team is excited to present to you our findings on sea level rise and adaptation planning in San Mateo County. I'd first like to start by introducing our team. This is Will, Alex, and I'm Isabelle. And this is a presentation of our findings, but we're putting together a final report, which will be released in a couple of days. And we're happy to answer any of your questions at the end of the presentation. To start, I will give an overview of our presentation. We'll first start with giving a little context of the project in San Mateo County. Then we will dive into some of our research findings and conclude with our recommendations and next steps for San Mateo County. As you can see from this chart, San Mateo County has been considered the ground zero for sea level rise. They're very susceptible to increasing tide levels, and in this map here, the high level scenario extends very far into the county area. So as you can see, there's a strong impetus for the county to really address how they can adapt for sea level rise moving forward. Some of the strategies for adapting to sea level rise include this list, which have intervention options in three main categories of accommodate, protect, both through a natural and engineered solution, as well as retreating. And this is a model that the neighboring city of San Francisco has also been contemplating and discussing in some of their sea level rise documents. As I mentioned earlier, sea level rise is very important in San Mateo County, and they recently released a vulnerability assessment document that really catalogs and predicts what the effects of sea level rise will be in the county. We really wanted our work to build off of this vulnerability assessment and try to take some of the risk that they had analyzed and make it more actionable and be able to address these concerns. We were also working as a policy team in parallel with a team from the School of Engineering. So Derek and the Stanford Sustainable Urban Systems team were also focusing on sea level rise from a more technical perspective. And to help the county really think about sea level rise, we wanted to help them with an adaptation framework. And when talking with the client, we really put together three main components of what they wanted to see in an adaptation framework. Our goal was really to help with these second two, as the first one, addressing key climate change impacts, was documented in their vulnerability assessment. But we were really helping the county identify what their goals and objectives were related to adaptation, and then also helping them identify and plan different approaches and adaptation strategies for addressing the impact of climate change. Therefore, we put together a series of three questions that really guided our research this quarter. Our first main objective was to understand what local jurisdictions within the county had been doing to address sea level rise. Then we wanted to identify what some of the best practices were from cities around the country. So these included New York, Boston, and Seattle. And they have been identified by the Office of Sustainability in San Mateo County as leaders that they wanted to really learn more about. And then lastly, we also had the opportunity to speak with stakeholders. And these stakeholders really informed our perception of what people within the county wanted to include as their values and priorities into this sea level rise adaptation framework. As a quick preview of our recommendations, we believe that the county can have the greatest impact by really guiding cities through creating a high-level county-wide vision for what sea level rise adaptation will look like in the future. Next, we believe that the county can help by prioritizing a focus on certain communities that we have categorized for the county. And then lastly, we believe that the county can help by having facilitated coordinated action. I would now like to pass the presentation over to Alex, who will discuss our methodology.
Thanks, Isabelle. So in order to achieve some of our objectives, I'll go over the methodology that was initially informed by the client and then sort of evolved as we discovered more resources that would inform our research. First, to start off though, the scope of our research, we initially had 4 members, then our team dropped to 3. So we moved our scope to just look at Bayside cities, which were the 11 Bayside cities in the 1 unincorporated area of North Fair Oaks. We suggest that the coastal jurisdictions be included in the county's further research, but it's not included in ours. We first evaluated city publicly available documents, which were general plans, climate action plans, and specific plans for 3 jurisdictions. Then we looked at the county's local hazard mitigation plan, their sea level rise vulnerability assessment. We went into some stakeholder interviews. We did 9 in total. Then we looked at the current adaptation projects, which are projects ongoing on the Bayside to address sea level rise and flooding. And then lastly, we turned towards external jurisdictions as asked to do so by the client in order to see which further along U.S. cities could inform the San Mateo County's work going forward. I'll jump into a few of our summary of research findings. The first was basically our synthesis of sea level rise related policies that we extracted from all of these documents. We categorized them so that the city could see what approaches the cities are taking. Then we'll go into our risk versus preparedness analysis, which is our relative rankings to help the county prioritize and to tailor their approaches with the cities. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the key interview themes that we took away from stakeholder interviews. First off was our survey of existing policies. It played really into objective 1, which is to get an idea of what planning is going on and what approaches people are taking. We went through hundreds of pages of general plans, specific plans, climate action plans, and we pulled out all policies related to flooding and sea level rise. We put them in a jurisdiction profile for the county to see exactly what each city has done and specified their actionable policies. Today we'll just talk about our categorization so you can get a feel for what approaches people are taking. The most prevalent was policies related to design and building codes. This had to do with elevating buildings or enforcing a setback from flood areas. The second most prevalent area was policies concerned with infrastructure planning that had to do with seawalls and levees. And then community engagement, financing, and partnerships were much less talked about, but we found them to be relevant in creating this holistic adaptation planning approach. Next, we did some risk and preparedness analysis. Basically, we used some proxies for risk to extract the 6 most at-risk cities for the county to focus on. And then we looked at the preparedness within each of those cities, which we measured by as actionable specific policies listed in these documents that we went through. I wanted to stress to the county and to you all today that these are relative rankings. In general, we don't think that any city is ready for sea level rise, wholly ready for sea level rise, but we suggest that the county can guide going forward. Our measures of risk came from 7 different sources. The first was the number of Class 4 infrastructure assets in each city from the vulnerability assessment. The second was the Sustainable Urban Systems Team's risk metric, which was AAL, the average annualized loss. This is still being developed, but we did incorporate it into our risk analysis. And then we took 4 measures from the local hazard mitigation plan that dealt with population, value structures, critical facilities within 6-foot flood inundation areas. And then we turned towards expected Bayside change to see if a lot of cities were planning on putting up structures along the Bayside that could be affected in the future. Our measure of preparedness was really focused on the documents that we looked through. And then we pulled out the sea level rise policies from the general plans, climate action plans, and specific plans. Then on top of that, we looked at the current adaptation projects, which are listed here. A lot of cities do have ongoing things that aren't listed in their general plans, so we wanted to look at these current projects so that we're incorporating that knowledge of what's going Our results were that these were the 6 highest risk cities. We think that the 3 cities on the right, Redwood City, Burlingame, and Foster City, have done a lot of great work that can inform and help catch up these other 3 at-risk cities who have also done a lot of good work but are not quite putting it into actionable terms yet. Those other 3 cities are San Mateo, East Palo Alto, and Menlo Park. We got a lot of good feedback at our client presentation on Wednesday, and we want to kind of clarify that these results are skewed a little bit more towards general plans that have been recently updated because they just had a tendency to include more of these policies. I think we received feedback that the scope of the research that the client gave us might not include everything, but we did the best delve given the time and the team capacity that we have. Next, Isabelle will go into the stakeholder values and priorities.
Thank you, Alex. As I mentioned earlier, we conducted a series of interviews because we were really interested in knowing what some of the values and priorities were of stakeholders in the county. So this really focused in on our 3rd objective for our research this quarter. We conducted a series of interviews with many different cities, city planners, also a community organization, Actera, and we had 4 main questions that we were asking during these interviews. We were really curious to know what the stakeholders' current involvement was with sea level rise. We also wanted to know what their goals and priorities were for addressing sea level rise, what some of their next steps were, and what they envisioned the role of the county to be when addressing sea level rise moving forward. I will now present 6 of our key themes and observations that we pulled out from these interviews. So we were really able to take a step back and look at an aggregate and see what themes were emerging. So our first concept that we came across was this tension between immediate versus long-term focus. We found that in many cases, a lot of the cities were addressing more immediate concerns, such as coastal erosion, wind-blown waves, or FEMA flood insurance remapping. And it was often through these contexts and these discussions that more dialogue was brought up about sea level rise, but often most of the focus and resources was going towards these more immediate concerns. Next, when talking about values and priorities, we found that there was great emphasis on having flexible plans. By flexible, we mean a plan that can adapt and change as projections for sea level rise change or different climatic events occur. And this is something that the Sustainable Urban Systems team has also been working on with their average annualized loss metric, which calculates in probability versus different distinct sea level rise scenarios. We also found that there was a strong emphasis on considering how different populations will be affected by sea level rise, how the environment is affected, and then also considering long-term consequences, since sea level rise and planning has a long-term lasting impact. Third was this idea of a necessity for coordination. We found that many cities acknowledged that what their neighboring city did to address sea level rise would greatly impact what they needed to do and what impacts they also had from sea level rise. So there's this idea that more coordination, more discussion was necessary. Also considering how planning together and working together could really help maximize resource usage in the city, and then also making sure they're planning for the same level of sea level rise, which will also be accounted for with this average annualized loss metric that I mentioned from the engineering team. Next was a discussion about some of the challenges. Directly tying back to this previous point, one of the main challenges was that it was hard to start these discussions with other cities, and so city planners were really looking for more guidance and ways to start these conversations and convenings. A next challenge was that while there's acknowledgement that the high-level sea level rise document I mentioned earlier was valuable, there was a desire for having more technical and specific guidance and plans that they could use to implement some of their own projects and be more aware of what some of these planning requirements would actually look like in their own city. And then lastly, there was the challenge about finding resources. A lot of cities wanted to have some more guidance on where they could look for funding and other technical financial support to help them achieve their goals in implementing some of these sea level rise projects. Next was the topic of public engagement. We found that public engagement had been very important and used commonly with addressing some of these immediate concerns that I mentioned, such as coastal erosion, but there wasn't as much public engagement on sea level rise, and this was something that people in the city acknowledged was necessary. So there was a takeaway that more public engagement and educational workshops related to sea level rise will be really important moving forward. And then lastly, the discussion about the role of the county. We found that, directly tying back to these previous points, a lot of city planners and community organizations wanted the county to really play this convening role of being a facilitator and helping foster these discussions and bringing together all of the players to have a more cohesive, unified vision and action plan for addressing sea level rise. Also helping connect cities to resources, such as finding places where they could apply for funding would also be critical. And then offering continued regional leadership, as there's an acknowledgement that the county will be a more sustained and long-term leader, whereas there might be more political turnover at the county level. I'd next like to hand over the presentation to Will, who will touch upon some of our research on external cities.
Thank you, Isabelle. The final section of our research is focused on what other vulnerable jurisdictions have done to plan for sea level rise. Our client recognizes that many other places in the United States are farther along in their efforts and would like to learn more. We reviewed 6 jurisdictions for this project, and I will summarize each of them for you now. Each jurisdiction was selected in consultation with the county. The 6 jurisdictions we looked at represent a mix of highly urban and suburban areas along both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts. I will share one particular highlight that we believe would be valued to San Mateo's adaptation framework. Southeast Florida is an example of how individual cities can work together towards coordinated climate action. The Regional Compact creates standardized online templates, allowing cities to customize a climate action plan unique to each city. This allows each city to use the same tools while addressing their own individual needs. This exemplary effort shows how the county might facilitate regional cooperation by providing templates and resources that can be customized to meet local needs while working towards a common set of regional goals. San Francisco's Sea Level Rise Action Plan is an extensive document with many lessons for San Mateo County as it starts its work on its adaptation plan. Much like San Mateo County, San Francisco faces similar local challenges. I would like to highlight 2 lessons from the San Francisco Sea Level Rise Plan. First, like San Mateo County, San Francisco is working towards its adaptation plan. San Francisco first started with a technical committee to look into sea level rise vulnerability for city-owned assets. This resulted in the development of recommendations about proactively incorporating sea level rise risk considerations into all new capital construction. San Francisco requires that any new construction receiving city capital funds must be incorporated into city guidance to address sea level rise vulnerabilities, risks, and adaptation. And then second, after developing these capital planning guidelines, the city created an action plan which lays out the necessary key steps leading up to the implementation of the adaptation plan. This includes an overarching vision and goals for sea level rise planning, identifying data gaps, and creating a roadmap for adaptation. We could see our work feeding into a similar type of action plan for the county, serving as an intermediary step before adaptation planning. We think there's great value in helping the public understand the many steps that San Mateo is taking to eventually create this adaptation framework. After Superstorm Sandy, New York developed a robust series of plans for sea level rise and flooding. In particular, New York has established very specific building requirements for structures in specific vulnerable locations. New York translates risks into building requirements by making it obvious, 1, what the actual steps are, and 2, what can and cannot be built in order to inform both the government and public on future land use. By following New York's focus on zoning and building design, including very technical and actionable items, San Mateo County can help coordinate regional guidance for all 11 Bayside cities. Boston has been very proactive in integrating citizens through general community outreach and educational workshops. They do an exemplary job in incorporating their community members in the planning of sea level rise. As you can see above, more than 15,000 people have been involved in creating a sea level rise plan. Boston's efforts can help inform the county as it begins community engagement, which our team has found essential to shaping an accurate and actionable plan. We wanted to highlight Seattle's mission which had a strong emphasis on equity, co-benefits, and natural systems. All three of these overlap with what the county has shared to be important pieces of its adaptation planning. Seattle's adaptation plan looks at the interaction between climate, the environment, health, society, and government. Seattle's work to elevate the social and behavioral context as part of adaptation planning will be very helpful to San Mateo County. In Charleston, we observed a strong commitment to community engagement. Charleston created a Together We Are Stronger campaign, which prioritizes the development of a network of informed and participative partners. The city created resources like an interactive map that allows residents to see how sea level rise projections change over time. For San Mateo County, Charleston's work shows how important it is to develop tools that are flexible, given that sea level rise projections are subject to change. I'd now like to transition to our team's final recommendations for the county as it continues its work on its adaptation framework. These recommendations are informed by our research of the local policies and context, stakeholder interviews, and our research into other vulnerable coastal areas. We've created 3 recommendations for how the county can play a role in each step of the adaptation planning process. One, based off external jurisdictions and interviews, we believe the county has an opportunity to guide sea level rise planning by working in coordination with stakeholders to create a unified high-level vision, much like Southeast Florida. And then second, based off our review of city policies, current projects, and public documents, we will outline certain communities that we believe the county can initially start with. And then third, based off our stakeholder interviews and research, which showed scenario planning inconsistencies, we see an important future role for the county to facilitate collaboration and info sharing. The county can play a leading role in developing a vision for sea level rise adaptation by 1, creating a unified mission statement, 2, convening focus groups to develop and inform goals, and then 3, setting countywide target date for planning achievements. In addition to a target date, we also envision milestones leading up to the target date in order to track progress along the way. We believe Boston's 2030 campaign does an excellent job laying out target dates such as these. We thought that San Francisco's mission statement was a great example, and it reads as follows. Make San Francisco a more resilient city in the face of immediate and long-term threats of sea level rise by taking measures to protect and enhance public and private assets, natural resources, and quality of life for all. We thought this was a great initial place for the county to start. Upcoming in our final report, we will share more mission statements and goals from each external jurisdiction. We think San Francisco is an excellent place for the county to initially consider. As stated earlier, we created 2 groups for the county to initially focus on. The first group is San Mateo, East Palo Alto, and Menlo Park. The second group is Redwood City, Burlingame, and Foster City. It's important to highlight, like Alex said, that these groups are compared relative to each other. They still have a lot to improve on with regards to sea level rise planning. We focused on these 2 groups because they are all high-risk areas and have shown impressive initial efforts in sea level rise planning. The county can focus on these 2 groups in order to inform the rest of the county. Because San Mateo County has limited resources, we thought this would be a good place to start. I'd like to now hand it off to Alex that will wrap up our 3rd recommendation.
Our 3rd recommendation deals with facilitation and increasing visibility and information sharing. We recommended 3 steps for the county to do so. The first one is to develop standards for sea level rise projections and localized standards. We referred them back to the State of California Sea Level Rise Guidance document, which suggests starting with the baseline and then looking at things like time frame, adaptive capacity, and risk tolerance to localize these values. We think that issuing a document with values will help planning managers address their Bayside without having to talk directly to one another all the time, talking about how high their seawalls are going to be or what distances their levees are going to be at. So this is the first step towards coordinating efforts. The second step is that the county should create a public resource that consolidates all of the strategies and guides future progress. We think the work that we've done and the work that the Sustainable Urban Systems team has also done informs this first step of consolidating resources and creating this policy repository. But then the county can also use it as a strategy for informing guiding principles, like talking about flexibility or filling those holes that we saw with financing by pointing cities towards grant opportunities. And then the last part of the facilitation component is more iterative. We suggest that the county track progress across cities to sustain coordinated and timely action. They have a really great website full of resources. We think a part of that website could be a sort of blog component where cities report back on what they're doing, so other cities can be informed as to the progress and the changes that will affect their own city. We also suggested that the county be responsible for these multi-jurisdictional projects, as it seems to be a gray area for who should be responding and reporting to the rest of the cities. Lastly, Isabelle will talk about some future considerations.
Thank you, Alex. As a final portion of our presentation, we wanted to outline what we believe are future things that the county should integrate and really contemplate when developing this adaptation framework. But before that, I first want to reframe and refresh our memory on our recommendations. So our first recommendation was that San Mateo County can address sea level rise by guiding cities through establishing this high-level vision for the county. Second, by prioritizing resources for specific communities that we've identified. And then lastly, by facilitating coordinated future action. So our first consideration and next step for the county is to expand our analysis from the Bayside cities to the coastal cities and other unincorporated areas within the county. Next is to really map and identify where the landowners and homeowners are on the bay and coast to help with coordinated future action. Also having a perspective and awareness that macro factors such as recessions, economic downturns, as well as natural disasters such as earthquakes and fires can both affect the planning process of future development and also addressing for sea level rise and how its impacts may change over time. And then lastly, also being aware that political context at this federal, state, as well as local level can really change and influence the direction of this long-term planning project. Of course, we'd like to acknowledge everyone who's helped us this quarter. We're very grateful to all of the people we interviewed and the organizations for their input was extremely valuable for identifying the values and priorities of stakeholders. We're also grateful to the Sustainable Urban Systems team for their technical expertise and advice throughout this process. We're also grateful to the Office of Sustainability in San Mateo County for their continued feedback and resources throughout this process. We'd also like to thank the support of the Public Policy Department, without which we could not have gotten this idea and this project. And then we also would like to thank our instructor and Professor Preety for her energy and enthusiasm definitely drove us throughout the quarter, and we really appreciate all of her guidance. So thank you all once again, and we would now be happy to open up for any questions.
So I'll take Bruce's question, which is the political side of it, but I'm going to do it from an economic perspective, so don't worry.
Oh, you're going to ruin it?
No. Can you go back 2 slides?
Definitely.
So the political context.
Mm-hmm.
And, sort of, it seems like you have issues of within cities, between cities, and between generations.
Mm-hmm.
Within cities, I think of, if you look at, my impression of the Bay Area is that it's kind of an income gradient as you go down, in San Mateo County, as you go down towards the Bay, income goes down. East Palo Alto, Bellhaven, Burlingame even, it's lower income as you get close to the Bay. And there'll be tensions within cities about where the money gets spent.
Mm-hmm.
Then the question of how do you, between San Mateo, Burlingame, South San Francisco, what are the impacts between them? And then how do you get people to focus on something that is 20, 30, 40 years away? And trying to think about, have you sort of provided guidance for how they should think about those different issues?
Well, I think one thing we picked up through our interviews is that with this immediate versus long-term focus, that it was through the more immediate challenges that they were able to have these public outreach sessions and get people then interested in, say, even though sea level rise might seem like a long-term challenge, the effects that can come from it will be things that we're already starting to see now. So I think that is one of the main ways that we're advising for getting people more interested in sea level rise, by really pointing to these immediate concerns and thinking about how that if you don't act now for addressing sea level rise, you'll have more of these immediate concerns. So really tying it into something that people can see now, it's tangible, is impacting them now.
And don't forget the infrastructure part that you also had in there, that the infrastructure, if the wastewater facilities are kicked out and the 101 is flooded and the airports are under, it affects everybody in the region. That would be the other, and you guys mentioned that, that was part of it.
And then with regards to funding, obviously like the individual cities want the county to pay them and give them money, and then the county doesn't really want to dish out a ton of money. So I think the middle ground we found was that the county can sort of lead different cities into like avenues of funding, where it's like there are a bunch of different programs that you can kind of apply for. So I don't think we've focused on exactly how each city would allocate their funds in different demographics.
But that said, I think you put your finger on exactly what the key problem is in terms of why they started their presentation by saying these are relative ratings.
Yeah.
You don't feel comfortable about where they are right now. And that, I think, is the perfect summary of where we are right now. There are some good individual actions. There's a lot of information that's starting to come out. But the big concern on the minds of all of us is how do you get from here to there? How do you do the implementation side? There's wonderful things being done by RBD and lots of interesting, cool designs that the tech people are going to come up with. But how do you get from here to there? What are the ways that we can actually make this happen? And you're absolutely right about the discounting. You left out another piece that you mentioned, and that is across the different counties, because the science on this suggests that what San Mateo does could affect Alameda or the North Bay, et cetera. And that's really the problem, I think, that's most vexing, because you look in the political science literature or in economics literature, we don't really have simple solutions about how to collaborate across jurisdictional lines, how to provide the incentives to think about the long term. I mean, we've thought about it a lot, and it comes up in a lot of different contexts, but it's not an easy behavioral problem to solve.
One quick comment just to directly respond, Greg. The engineering students delved really deeply into the specifics of who was affected directly and indirectly, as well as whether certain groups were disproportionately impacted. And we had the same assumption that there was this low-income gradient, but we wanted to challenge that specifically by counting it. So looking at the number of households in San Mateo County overall, and 35% of them making, say, less than $75,000 a year. And then we counted the blockers and numbers of households and different income groups of the flooded areas, and found that it was actually the same proportion. It was 65% of folks making over $75,000 were affected. And so it didn't seem like there was just by household count, a difference. But then you switch over to saying, are low-income communities impacted more by the same amount of flooding? And that's definitely true if you normalize that by their ability to recover and their ability to pay with discretionary income. So we looked really into those details, and our initial hypothesis actually was surprising enough.
I should have excluded Foster City from that group of the income gradient. I think it's probably different place.
And just a quick thought, Derek's group, so when we presented to the client on Wednesday, we had two from the policy students kind of teed up the context, and then Derek's group presented his findings.